about the book. What I would like to do is three separate things, although all three of these things will be closely related, as will become apparent as I go along here. First, what I want to do is lay out my basic theory of international politics that tells you why the international system is basically a nasty and brutish place. And after I do that, I want to switch gears and I want to talk about hegemony and exactly what hegemony means. Now, in the first part of my talk, when I tell you why international politics is a nasty and a brutish place, I'm going to tell you that great powers seek above all else hegemony. That's the outcome of my simple theory. Okay? Again, in the second part, what I want to do is sort of operationalize, to use social science speak, what I mean by hegemony. What does it mean to pursue hegemony in the modern world? And then the third thing that I want to do is I want to shift to the subject of the future of U.S.-Chinese relations and talk about what they're likely to look like in the event that China continues to modernize economically. In other words, it continues to grow into a more powerful state economically, and I will argue militarily. Now, it might not seem at this point that all three of those subjects are closely related, but as we go along here, I think it'll become manifestly apparent that that is the case. So back to the first subject, which is the question of why international politics is a nasty and brutish business where states seek hegemony. My simple theory starts from what I think are five rather non-controversial assumptions about the structure of the international system. And what I argue is that when you take those five simple assumptions, you put them into the blender and you hit the on switch and you mix them up, what you get is a rather nasty world. But by themselves, those five assumptions don't portray the world as particularly competitive or particularly brutish. Now, what are the five assumptions? The first assumption is that the international system is dominated by states, and there is no higher authority that sits above states. Yes, there are institutions like the United Nations, there was once the League of Nations, and these institutions do play some role in international politics, but they play a minor role. States are the principal actors in the system, and this system is anarchic. Now, when you use the word anarchy, people think you mean murder and mayhem. But as many of you know, in international relations, that's not the case. To say that a system is simply anarchic is to say that it has no higher authority. It's the opposite of hierarchic. So what we're saying is that the international system is basically comprised of states that look like billiard balls on a pool table, right? They have no higher authority above them. They are the principal actors in the system. That's assumption number one. Assumption number two is that all states have some offensive military capability. Now, there's no question that that military capability varies from case to case. But the fact is that all states, at all times, have at least some offensive military capability. So I like to say to people, we usually identify military capability with tanks and aircraft carriers and guns. But the fact of the matter is that if states were comprised of nothing more than human beings, with loincloths on, as long as those human beings had their feet and hands, they could walk across the border with another state and use their hands to kill people on the other side. For every neck, there are two hands to squeeze it. So the point is that states have some offensive capability. The third assumption, which is of great importance, is that states can never be certain about the intentions of other states. In other words, you can't be certain that a state that lives next door to you or lives reasonably near to you at some point down the road won't have malign intentions. That's not to say you could be certain that another state will have malign intentions. It's only to say that you can't be certain that that state won't have malign intentions. For example, there's nobody in this audience who can tell me what Germany's intentions will be in the year 2020, or what China's intentions will be in the year 2020, or even what America's intentions will be in the year 2020. There's just no theory, no mechanism available to discern intentions over the long run. To sort of emphasize this point from a different perspective, and it's a very important point to grasp, let me talk a little bit about marriage and divorce. When people get married, they almost axiomatically assume that the person they're marrying is wonderful, and that that person is going to be wonderful forever. The fact that we have a 50% divorce rate in this country tells you that that assumption is not very sound. The fact of the matter is, if you think about it, anytime you get married to someone, it's almost impossible to tell what he or she is going to look like in terms of their basic behavior towards you 20 or 30 years down the road. The fact of the matter is, you may be marrying Svengali and just not know it. And there is no way you could figure out what your wife-to-be or husband-to-be will look like in 20 or 30 years. You can never be certain of that person's intentions. Now, that's not to say you can be certain that you're marrying a person who's going to turn on you. Of course, that's not the case. My only point is you can't be certain that the person won't turn on you. First assumption is that the system is anarchic. It's comprised of states and it's anarchic. Second assumption is that states have some offensive military capability. And third is you can never be certain about intentions. Fourth and fifth assumptions are rather straightforward. Fourth assumption is that states are interested in survival. It's their highest goal. This is not to say states don't have other goals like prosperity, but their highest goal is survival. Fifth assumption is that states are basically strategic calculators, rational actors. They are pretty adept at coming up with clever strategies for figuring out how to survive in the international system. Now, those are the 5 assumptions. And as I said, no one of those assumptions that I've laid out says that the world is highly competitive and that war is a possible or a likely outcome, right? But when you take those 5 assumptions and you put them into the blender and you hit the on switch, you get a very competitive world. To be more specific, you get 3 forms of behavior that come right to the surface. First is that states fear each other. Now, why do states fear each other? States fear each other basically for 2 reasons. One, they fear each other because other states may have hostile intentions to go along with their offensive capabilities, and you can't be sure they won't come after you. In other words, if you're France and you live next door to Germany, you can never be absolutely sure, right, that Germany somewhere down the road won't have hostile intentions and build military forces and come after you. So that's one reason you fear Germany. The second reason that you fear Germany is the 911 problem. This goes back to anarchy. The fact of the matter is that there's no higher authority in the international system that you can appeal to if you get into trouble. If you dial 911 in international politics, you know who's at the other end? Nobody, right? This leads to the second form of behavior that results in this system that I'm describing to you. The first being fear. The second is that states quickly understand that it's a self-help world. God helps those who help themselves in international politics. You can't rely on other people to pull your chestnuts out of the fire, because it just might not be in their selfish interest when the money's on the table for them to come to your rescue. And the end result is that you may end up looking like France in 1870 or France in 1940. So the fact of the matter is that states quickly decide that the best way to protect themselves is to protect themselves, right, and not to rely on others. Now, the third form of behavior, which is the most important form of behavior that comes out of this simple theory, is that the best way to ensure your survival in the international system is to be the most powerful state in the international system, to be the hegemon. To put it in more colloquial terms, the best way to survive in the international system is to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block. I'll get to this in a second, but to get ahead of myself, best situation you could possibly have is to be the United States in the Western Hemisphere. How many of you people go to bed at night worrying about Canada or Mexico attacking us? How many of you worry about Cuba or Guatemala or Brazil or Argentina attacking us? The answer is nobody worries about that. Why? Because we are so powerful that none of those states would ever think about attacking us. Would you substitute a situation where we had China on our border and Germany on our other border? Of course not. We like the situation we now have in the Western Hemisphere perfectly well, because we are by far the most powerful state in the region. The basic line that I'm trying to get across here is that the more powerful you are relative to all of your potential adversaries, the more secure you are, because it's highly unlikely that they will come after you. Now, the fact of the matter is that every great power in the system understands the basic logic of this situation, and every great power strives to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block. The end result of all this is that you get security competition, sometimes very intense security competition among the great powers. Not in large part because great powers are atavistic at heart or have malign intentions, but because in the international system where you have a significant 911 problem, the best way to assure your survival is to be the hegemon in the system. But again, everybody gets this message, so you get this constant competition for power, this constant competition among the players to see who is going to be the hegemon and be in the best position to assure survival. That's the basic theory. Now, I want to talk more about the subject of hegemony, and this is the second part of my talk. I've made much to you about the fact that states want to be the hegemon in the system, but I've not said very much about what it means to be the hegemon in the system. Although there's much talk about being a global hegemon and dominating the entire globe, I do not believe it is possible for any one state to dominate the entire globe, to be a hegemon across the entire face of the earth. This is in part because of the sheer distances involved, but it's mainly because of the difficulty of projecting power across large bodies of water like the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So I would argue there's no way that any single state can be a global hegemon. The best that you can do is that you can become a regional hegemon. You can dominate your own particular region of the world, and then make sure that no other state on the face of the globe dominates its region the way you dominate your region. Now, to illustrate this line of argument, let's talk about the United States, because I believe that this policy reflects how the United States has acted in the international system since the very beginning. And I believe, by the way, it's a history that no Americans, or hardly any Americans, appreciate in any meaningful way. So I want to lay it out for you here very briefly. Because the United States is the only example of a state in the modern international system that has achieved regional hegemony. Other states have tried, but they've never succeeded. The United States is the only state that has succeeded. The United States also has gone to great lengths to make sure that it has never had a peer competitor. And we'll talk a little bit more about these things right now. If you go back to the beginning of this country in 1776, we're basically comprised of 13 measly colonies strung out along the Atlantic seaboard. By 1900, the United States was the hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. This was the result of conscious policy decisions from the beginning. There were two elements to our policy. The first was manifest destiny, where basically we decided that we would cross the entire continent, conquer huge portions of land, and build a superstate called the United States of America. This was not done by accident. This was done on purpose. It was done for a lot of reasons. One of the main reasons was security. We wanted to make sure that we were very big and we were very powerful and that nobody could threaten our survival. And you want to bet your bottom dollar when the time comes that we cared very much about our survival from the very beginning. Think about how we gained our independence in 1776. Think about the fact that we fought the British in 1812. Think about the fact that there were huge European empires in this hemisphere when things first got started in the late 18th century. So the first thing we did was we built a superstate. We conquered huge amounts of territory, killed massive numbers of people, defeated other states in war. Then we imported in huge numbers of immigrants to fill the land. We built a powerful economy. Furthermore, we went to great lengths to get the Europeans out of this hemisphere. You all know about the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. President Monroe basically told the Europeans, I'm not strong enough to throw you out now, but I want to tell you loudly and clearly, you're not going to build any more empires in this hemisphere, and we're going to go to great lengths over the course of this century to throw you out of our hemisphere, because we don't want you monkeying around in our hemisphere. And that's what we spent the rest of the 19th century doing, running those European empires out of town. And by 1900, the United States was a superstate I think, in terms of latent military power, the most powerful state on the face of the globe, and there were no more European empires left in our hemisphere. We had established regional hegemony, and this was not done by accident. It was done on purpose. Furthermore, the United States spent most of the 20th century going to great lengths to make sure that we had no peer competitors around the globe. Uncle Sam, under no circumstances, is willing to tolerate peer competitors. I'll tell you the basic story in outline form. Imperial Germany. We went to war in 1917, in my opinion, because it looked like Germany was going to dominate all of Europe. We helped cut Imperial Germany off at the knees and prevent them from dominating Europe. We went to war against Nazi Germany in 1941, although we really began to spin up in 1940 with the fall of France, because we were fearful that Nazi Germany would do what Imperial Germany tried to do and failed. We helped defeat Nazi Germany. Imperial Japan in Asia, which threatened to dominate all of Asia the way Germany wanted to dominate all of Europe. We went to war against them in 1941 and cut them off at the knees. When World War II ended and it looked like the Soviet Union might dominate all of Europe, we moved into Europe very quickly, and we went to great lengths to balance against the Soviet Union very quickly. We were aggressive from the very beginning of the Cold War until the very end, because we had no intention of letting the Soviet Union dominate Eurasia, just the way we had no intention of letting Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, or Imperial Japan dominate Europe and Asia. The United States does not tolerate peer competitors. As far as we're concerned, we're allowed to be the only peer competitor on the face of the globe, and the historical record is quite clear on this point. So that's what hegemony means. Now, let me switch gears and talk about China. The question of how you deal with China. Now, as you know, in the Clinton administration and in the business wing of the Republican Party, there's this widespread belief in the land that if we make China look like us, that we're not going to have any problems with a prosperous or a wealthy China down the road. The idea is that if you get them hooked on capitalism and you make them filthy rich, and you get them hooked on democracy and turn them into a liberal democracy like we are, and then you get them embedded in all these international institutions that we used to be so fond of, then we're not going to have any serious trouble with these folks. Now, why is that the case? That's the case because they're going to emulate us. And that means that they're not going to cause any trouble in the world, because the United States never causes any trouble in the world. All the trouble in the world is caused by other people. We're the good guys, right? And if we could just make others look like us, we would all live happily ever after. And of course, the basic story put out by businessmen in the Republican administration and the Clintonites was that what we got to do is make China look like us. These people have the story all wrong. If China gets wealthy, it's going to look like us, only it's not going to look like us the way they think it's going to look like us. It's going to look like us the way I just described us to you in the past 10 minutes. And let me tell the story to you in a bit more detail. If China becomes a giant Hong Kong, it's probably going to have about 4 times the gross national product of the United States. You understand, at the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union had at most half the gross national product of the United States. Given the population disparities between us and the Chinese, if they have a per capita GNP that looks anything like our per capita GNP, they're probably going to outdistance us somewhere in the range of 3, 4, maybe even 5 to 1. Terms of gross national product. You can build one heck of a lot of armored division equivalents, nuclear weapons, aircraft carrier battle groups with that kind of GNP. But of course, the assumption of liberals, both in the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, is that China wouldn't do that, right? And I say, why wouldn't they do that? Why wouldn't China emulate us? If you're China, right? If you're China, don't you want to be the hegemon in Asia? Don't you want your own Monroe Doctrine? Don't you want to tell Uncle Sam that he's not welcome in your region of the world? You understand, we have told the Chinese loudly and clearly they are not welcome in our region of the world. No great power is welcome to bring its military forces into the Western Hemisphere. You all are old enough to remember how crazy we used to go during the Cold War. During the Cold War, when the Soviets would put military forces in Cuba, right? Can you imagine what we would do if the Chinese began to deploy military forces into a place like Mexico or Cuba? We would not like that at all. Why do you think that China is going to be enthusiastic about us staying in Asia with a large military force once it has the capability to dominate that region? I think it's highly unlikely that they will be happy about that situation. I think they will go to considerable lengths to dominate Asia and to get us out of Asia, the same way we went to considerable lengths between 1776 and 1900 to dominate the Western Hemisphere. Again, this is not because I believe the Chinese are evil people, or to put it in different terms, because I believe the United States is filled with evil people. It's because the best way to survive in an anarchic system where other states may someday come after you is to make sure that you are the biggest and baddest dude on the block, which, when translated into practical terms in international politics, means to make sure that you dominate your region of the world. You have no other state in your region that can seriously threaten you militarily, and furthermore, across the rest of the globe, there is no peer competitor. That's dominated our foreign policy. Why do you think it's not going to dominate Chinese foreign policy as China gets more and more powerful? I would argue that China will behave that way. This brings us to the question of how do you think the United States will respond to this? What is going to be the American part of this story? Well, I think the evidence is quite clear on this. The United States has a rich record of trying to cut off at the knees any potential hegemon in either Europe or Asia that looks like it might someday be a peer competitor. If we did not tolerate Kaiser Bill's Germany, Adolf Hitler's Germany, Tojo's Japan, or Stalin's Soviet Union as peer competitors, why do you think we will tolerate China as the dominant force in Asia? The fact of the matter is we will not. We will go to great lengths to contain them and to cut them off at the knees, just as we did with those 4 other potential hegemons that precede China in this hypothetical situation. So the basic storyline that I'm telling you is that if China continues to grow economically, which means it will have the wherewithal to develop a mighty, formidable military capability, it will emulate the United States, and it will try, I believe, to establish hegemony in Asia the way we have established hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And the United States, on the other hand, will go to great lengths by forming an alliance with Japan, Korea, Vietnam, India, and Russia, just to name the main partners, to create a counter-hegemony coalition that can contain China and hopefully, over the long term, ruin it as a peer competitor. Because again, although Americans don't like to admit these things, the fact of the matter is we don't tolerate hegemons anywhere else in the globe but in the Western Hemisphere. And here, we are the hegemon. Thank you.